Hey guys, and welcome to another day of ELA Summer School. I wanted to go over the story that I gave you guys that I assigned for homework, the mentor text, T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns. This story is about an experience of one girl in an airport with her father. T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns is the title. I always want you guys to take advantage of an effective and creative title and capturing your reader's attention from the very beginning. I think that's important. You can always add an additional layer and dynamic of meaning and depth to your writing through your title. So I always want you guys to pay attention to how effective titles work. TSA and Cinnamon Buns. TSA meaning the security checkpoint in an airport, transit and security association, and Cinnamon Buns being a reference to, I believe, Cinnabon, which is the popular cinnamon bun place. If you guys have traveled or if you are familiar with a travel experience, you have to go through a security checkpoint to board an airplane, and this is the experience that this particular writer was talking about and narrating about. All right, so another thing that we're going to be doing on our essays, our personal narratives, including a photo. So that's something you're going to be doing on your final essay that we'll be working toward completing next week. Notice as we look at this, I wanted you guys to annotate and read this for homework, and I want you to pay attention to these type of things that we're going to discuss, these types of aspects of writing that I'm going to discuss here as it relates to both structure and strategies. That's going to be something you hear me talk about quite often as it relates to your writing, my writing, and the mentor text that I expose you guys to is structure and strategies of effective writing. In this case, it's a narrative, so it's going to follow a certain structure based on what I told you guys or what I shared with you guys, which is this basic plot structure. It's your story arc, which starts with exposition, hits a point of conflict, has rising action toward resolution and resolving that conflict, hits a climactic point with falling action in the aftermath, working its way toward an endpoint resolution where things are either back to normal, different, or never the same. So as you look at this type of structure, I want you to compare this to the story by Ruhani Chhabra, T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns, and see how she uses this structure, but she's got it sequenced a little bit differently. She doesn't have it linear, in a linear fashion as is represented here. Now, the first thing you're going to want to notice here is the very first line serves as a paragraph itself. So this is a way of using paragraphing, like I told you before, to make certain elements of your writing and aspects of it stand out. So Ruhani, in this case, wanted to make this very first sequence of activity, which was the TSA security officers telling her father, which we'll learn about below, telling her father to take off the turban. She wanted to have that stand out so much that she put it as not only the first sentence, but as a paragraph itself, a paragraph onto itself. So I think this is an effective strategy. And remember, we talked about strategies in terms of using dialogue and using quotes to start a story, and that's what she's done here. When you read, you're going to have to take that thing off, sir. We're getting a lot of, we're being shown a lot. We talk about show versus tell. That statement right there and the context of it already tells you that there's a power dynamic going on here, that one person has authority over another person and they're giving them a command. Now, this is important because this is going to motivate your reader to keep reading this. We want to know, we're going to naturally be curious to find out, is this a police officer telling someone to do something, or is this, a soldier, or is someone being held up somewhere, by a criminal? So this is going to propel your story, and this is going to pique the curiosity of your reader, starting off with a quote such as this. So we talked about strategies, starting out with a quote, very effective job by Ruhani there in starting this story. Then we get this section here where we learn about the exposition, the context of what's going on here. Yet another TSA officer had just arrived. I cast a nervous glance at my father, who was extremely calm, even as he explained, for the third time, that he couldn't unwrap the turban on his head. One, it would take too long to put back on. Two, it was against his faith. The sentence hung heavily in the cinnamon-scented air. I resisted the urge to run through the metal detectors, shoes on and everything. So here we have the exposition, where we have the background information of what's going on. We also have, in this section here, a bit of not only exposition, but also descriptive language. So you have vivid descriptive language, which can function to appeal to the five senses. You can use descriptive language to talk about things that you touch, things that you feel, things that you hear, things that you smell, and things that you see. Now, the two most common descriptive elements in storytelling and writing are, as you might probably guess, smell and sight. So anytime you're using descriptive language, there's a preponderance to use smell and sight as what we're conveying. And here, the cinnamon-scented air is an example of that. I resisted the urge to run through the metal detectors. Again, we have a little bit more information on setting and exposition as well. Make no mistake, I didn't want to be embarrassed about my religion. In Sikhism, dignity is as fundamental as the turban. But when you're 12 years old, awkward, pimply, and painfully aware of the stares and mutterings from speedy holiday travelers, it's hard to muster that pride. Notice here we have, again, more exposition. We now know that Ruhani is 12 years old. She's feeling awkward. We get information about their religion, which will be a focal point in setting the context of this story and understanding what's going on here. It shouldn't have turned out like this. My father and I had embarked on an impromptu trip to surprise his relatives, and the events resembled a Charlie Brown Christmas special until we reached the dreaded corner of the airport. All right, here I want to point out how she effectively uses, when she says dreaded corner of the airport, again, this is setting. This is functioning as giving you another example of setting, but it functions as even more than that. And I want you guys to pay attention to this as you read and start noticing things like that, like this, how the how the writer is using this term dreaded corner to really give you a lot of information. It's show versus tell, and it's also a lot is inferred and implied with that one comment. For one thing, the very word dreaded is giving you the sense that she's experienced this before. So she's dreading it. Even walking in the airport, she's had this experience before where, and we'll find this out later, where she's been scrutinized by the TSA, presumably in her mind because she's of a different ethnicity and background and race, but that we'll get to that in a minute. But dreaded corner of the airport. Also notice the way she uses the word corner as to imply, now I take her word for it that it was the corner, but this also implies the fact that you are cornered, that the authority figure has power over you, that you're trapped, that you're in a corner, that you're feeling as though you're restrained, and you're kind of, we have this expression, backed into a corner or painted in a corner. So she dreaded this experience, and it involves a corner. So that's just a very subtle aspect, but I want you to start noticing things like that in your reading. To distract myself, I concentrated on the sugary aroma coming from the diner in the terminal. We always ate there before our flights. I love their cinnamon buns. I associate a peculiar sense of freedom with those baked goods. Their sweet taste meant we'd finished with security, free of scrutiny. Okay, again, more exposition here, more descriptive language related to smell, the scent of the cinnamon buns that she's associating with freedom, the sweetness of freedom. A little bit more exposition. Apparently, she's gone through airport security many times and felt on the other end almost a relief and a happiness that she's associating with these cinnamon buns. Having brown skin and a head covering means you're practically begging for a random TSA check. I figured that out around the same age that I learned how to put on an airplane seatbelt on my own. However, this demand was significantly worse. Still, I wanted to comply, wanted to rid myself of the scabbiness of being different. Okay, here we have rising action going on. So this demand was different. There's tension going on here based on the fact that she's feeling different. They're going through this checkpoint. And as we'll find out later as we continue reading, my father, who knew he would forever be considered different from the moment he walked in this country, persisted. Again, we have both exposition here and rising action. He's persisting. He doesn't want to take off the turban. So he's saying, nope, not doing it. I'm not taking off the turban. He'd been to this airport before, and they let him have this turban scan instead of removing it. What could have changed? Again, this is part of the rising action and the tension involved in what's going on here. She's trying to make sense of, as is the dad, hey, what's different? We've been through this security checkpoint before. It's same old, right? To which the officer said, it's the holiday season. The palace officer said, rolling his eyes. Security's tighter. Just make a decision. Can't you see the little girl's waiting too? The little girl he's talking about there waiting is Ruhani, the daughter. So he's basically explaining, hey, security is tighter. Come on, man, just make a decision. Let's get going. Do what you got to do. Either take off your turban or you're not getting on this plane. Look at your daughter. She's embarrassed. As we see there, if I was embarrassed before, it was nothing compared to how I felt now, with all eyes on me. I wanted to shrink to the ground. So this is this embarrassing moment. The tension is rising. You're wanting to get on this airplane. People are probably yelling at you and rolling their eyes and muttering things, under their breath. And all the while, you're trying to preserve your faith, a symbol of your faith, the turban, and just the practical sense that, hey, to undo this thing would be very inconvenient, and it's never been a problem before. I had always feared the possibility of such humiliating precautions imposed on my father, and I'd always thought that I would speak up. Even a simple, don't talk to him that way, would suffice. Yet I looked up, turned to my father, and said, just take it off. And the way he sighed let me know that I'd won. It was a rather haunting victory. So notice here that this is actually the climax of the story, where the daughter, Ruhani, looks up and says, Dad, just take it off. And then the dad takes it off, the turban. Perhaps I'm being too harsh on my younger self. After all, I was severely insecure and surrounded by years' worth of schoolyard ignorance. So, why does your dad wear that rag? Which morphed into my buried shame. And it took me a while to realize I had to dispel it. It took me even longer to learn how. In the years to come, I discovered the cathartic space of transcribing my feelings on paper. At that moment, though, I simply internalized everything: the embarrassment, the confusion, and, most of all, the gnawing guilt. I watched impassively as my father removed his turban. Okay, here, everything that's going on here in the aftermath, him removing the turban, every meaningful layer peeled away in front of the whole crowd. This is all part of falling action. The officers circling around like angry piranhas took one long look and then dismissed us. It was over. Okay, so falling action. Also here, where it says it's over, I want you guys to understand this is not part of the climax. This is actually part of falling action. So when it says it was over, that's also part of falling action. So you might think that's a climactic moment, and it might sound like it, but it's actually part of the falling action. Or so I thought. My father, never one to hold a grudge, still brought me some cinnamon buns. I took them under the flight and looked out the window at the bright blue American sky, wondering why they didn't taste as sweet as before. Again, this is all falling action here related to the aftermath of what's going on. The actual, I'm not sure if you guys got this when you were doing this, but the actual resolution was this. Was Ruhani learning that she can internalize all these feelings through writing. So all the elements are here in Ruhani's story of our story arc. They're just in a different spot. The conflict is actually at the beginning of the story with that quote where the officer's telling her father to take the turban off. The resolution, she actually mentions here in this area. And of course, we have the climactic moment of taking the turban off.